All right, greetings, friends, and welcome to this episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show. So great to have you along with us for the podcast. After what's been an interesting and a busy week in Alberta, certainly a lot of continued focus on the referendum, the Premier's decision, of course, to put a separation question on the ballot for October. I did have an opportunity to sit down for a conversation with the Premier about her referendum strategy. You can check that out at nationalpost.com. So that continues to dominate a lot of the conversation. I mean, we've had a couple of recent polls suggesting that support for separation has softened a bit, which is interesting. We'll see if that trend continues. Of course, you also had the Alberta government announce this independent panel that's going to look into the cost of separation, what that would actually entail. I think important information for Albertans to have before a vote. I know the Premier recently raised some eyebrows around that, angered, I think, the separatists by talking about the substantial cost, pinning it at around $400 billion. So we'll see if this report comes back with something similar to what the Premier had outlined. So there's that aspect of the debate. There was also, by the way, related to the referendum, what appears to be the decision from the Alberta government that this water not coal petition that Corb Lund has been leading, that appears to have succeeded, probably won't get on the ballot in October, despite the Premier's previous assurances that it probably would. So there's that wrinkle in the referendum debate, plus ongoing conversation and debate around the cost of holding this referendum and now the 10 questions on the ballot. So that obviously looms large in the conversation in Alberta. But another issue jumped to the forefront this week, and it concerns the price of gasoline. It concerns the Alberta government's revenue that derives from the higher price of oil, which of course has led to the higher price of gasoline. Now, this goes back to Jason Kenney, of course, the new policy where if the price of oil gets to a certain point, the taxes that the Alberta government collects on gasoline would come down, either partially or fully. It's a 13-cent excise tax, which for now has been applying in full. Now, with the conflict in Iran, oil prices have spiked recently, although they have come down a little bit as of late. But the Alberta government has a formula where we have to wait and see what the trend is. And the trend was certainly pointing to a decision to bring down that tax. But instead, a bit of a curveball this week from the Premier saying, we're going to go ahead with some relief, but instead of reducing the gasoline tax, we're going to issue $100 rebates.
Our government recognizes that families are feeling the pinch, which is why we're taking action to put more money back in their pockets. Beginning July 1st, nearly 3.4 million Albertans will be eligible to receive $100 through the new Alberta Energy Rebate. The Energy Rebate will put tax dollars collected over recent months of elevated energy prices back in the hands of Albertans to help with the cost of fuel and other household needs. Rather than relying on retailers to pass on the fuel tax relief, this approach will ensure elevated oil revenues deliver real benefits to Albertans, benefits that don't disappear at the pumps. This rebate replaces the fuel tax relief program, which temporarily paused all or part of the 13-cent per litre provincial fuel tax when oil prices reaches a certain threshold. When the federal government suspended its 10 cents a litre fuel excise tax earlier this year, those savings were seemingly erased at the pumps within days and before Albertans could actually feel any relief. In practical terms, the energy rebate gives Albertans real returns now on the higher oil prices already seen in the previous months, delivering families, we estimate, over 50% more than the fuel tax relief program was projected to provide over the next 3 months. So whether the priority is groceries, bills, rent, or fuel, the energy rebate ensures flexible support, with guaranteed support for every eligible Albertan, driver or not.
So this is interesting. So the government maintains that this is in keeping with the law that stipulates that the gasoline tax should come down. I mean, basically, the cost is the same. But to go about it in this way, $100 doesn't seem like a lot. I think people are going to have to basically apply for this or register through the government website in July. So there's that additional layer of frustration. This has not gone over well, which I don't know that the government was anticipating this amount of backlash around this policy. So that's come to the forefront in the debate in Alberta. So like I say, it's been a busy week and a lot going on. Well, joining us for more on everything going on in Alberta, this issue, the separation debate, all the rest. Very pleased to welcome back to the show Lorne Gunter, veteran political columnist for Post Media, EdmontonSun.com, EdmontonJournal.com. Lorne, great to have you back with us here.
Thanks. Good to be back.
It's been an interesting week, I think, even just in a lot of ways. I want to ask you first of all about this rebate. And it's kind of funny because I think the premier would rather keep the focus on, issues with Ottawa, dealing with the Fed, standing up for Alberta. But as premier, she does have to deal with these other things. And one of the dilemmas they face now with higher oil prices is how to respond to that, right? Instead of going ahead with a gasoline tax cut, they've shifted now to this rebate, which got a lot of backlash, surprisingly. Yeah, let me get your thoughts, first of all, on that.
Well, I should have got a lot of backlash. There's a provincial law that says if after 3 months of oil prices being above $90 a barrel, which they have been, you have to reduce the excise tax on gasoline by 13 cents a liter. And so they're ignoring that. It's a law. I'm not sure how they can ignore it. But they said, oh, no, we're just going to give a $100 check to everyone. And that's about the same amount that you would save over the next 3 months with lower gas taxes. No, it's not. I mean, for a lot of people, that's much less than they would save. I don't resent the fact that people who ride their bikes and take buses to work and school and never paid the higher gas taxes are going to get $100, because in some ways they did pay higher gasoline taxes through the price of their food and some of the other things they were buying.
Right.
But, for those of us who knew for 3 months that this relief was coming and it's now not coming, that's just political suicide. Like, I don't understand why they're doing this.
It's strange because, the cost is the same. Like, the price tag is the same. And they kept pointing to that. Okay. But it just makes it all the stranger, I guess, that they chose to go this route if they're not saving any money. Why do you think they did?
And the other thing that bothers me about this is that anyone who makes more than $250,000 a year, and there are a lot of people in Alberta who make more than $250,000 a year, get nothing. Well, They were paying the same high gasoline taxes as everyone else. Why aren't they getting some relief too? I don't think they want a check for 100. They just want the price of gasoline to come down. And psychologically, it's a much bigger thing to take 13 cents off the price on the sign outside your neighborhood gas station than it is for you to get a $100 check in the mail sometime in July that recognizes the sacrifice you've made from the time Trump started bombing Iran until the end of June. There were very few days in that period where the price of West Texas Intermediate, which is the gas or the oil that triggers these gasoline rebate or these gasoline price rollbacks or not. There's very few days during that period when West Texas Intermediate wasn't above $90 a barrel. And there were no days when it was as low as $80 a barrel. So the law is very clear. It should have kicked in. And we should, between July 1 and October 1, have prices that are 13 cents a liter cheaper. This reminds me of Justin Trudeau's carbon tax rebates. There you are at the pump paying his carbon tax every time you fill up your tank, and no one's standing there saying, oh, it's okay, because I know sometime in the next quarter, the federal government is going to send me a rebate that will cover some of this. There's a disconnect in time and in activity, and people just do not buy it.
One rationale I thought was weird when the premier alluded to, retailers gobbling up that tax cut, which seems odd coming from this government, that big bad oil companies are going to rip us off somehow. But if that's the concern, why is this the law and the policy in the first place?
One of the first economic lessons I learned in the 90s when I was talking to a really good economist from McGill is that gasoline stations do not typically rip people off because they're the only business in the world that posts their price for everyone to see out front. And you can see it across the street at the next gasoline station. You can go down the block, 3 blocks, and there's another one with this price up. If you don't like the price at the gasoline station nearest you, drive around a couple minutes. You're going to find a lower price. So it's unlikely that gasoline retailers were going to rip anybody off and not give them the 13 cent a liter rebate, because there just is no competitive advantage for them to do that.
So it's interesting because it sort of ties into what we're seeing right now, where polls are suggesting that the UCP is still doing okay. The
Well,
NDP have maybe made up a bit of ground, but the premier herself, her approval rating is down, and so I think that speaks to a lot of issues, and a lot of it having to do with the upcoming referendum and all of that. But does it suggest that there's aside from the fight with Ottawa, maybe a lack of focus or lack of direction here?
I don't know about lack of focus or direction, but I do think that there is kind of a tin ear for retail politics. Can you imagine? I mean, I know Ralph Klein sent us all his Ralph bucks, but he also kept prices down because they could get by on the money they were making from the oil field. Can you imagine Ralph trying to sell us all on, oh, sorry, I'm not going to lower your gasoline prices. I'm going to send you a check for $100. Isn't that great? That to me is tone deaf retail politics.
The referendum, though, of course, seems to be all consuming right now in a lot of ways. You had a couple interesting columns this week. One of them, and it gets to this issue, and the Fraser Institute actually put out a study this week, and it sort of speaks to some of this underlying debate here. The contribution Alberta makes to the rest of the country, the economic engine that Alberta represents, and why there's frustration or resentment in Alberta as to how that's all perceived, how that ties into the separation debate. You wrote a piece, and it was interesting because the idea that we're not necessarily looking to overhaul that or change that. We could probably improve it in some ways, but it's just sort of about that respect, and that's a big driver in all of this.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the Fraser Institute said that since 2007, we've been paying more into Confederation than we're getting out since the 60s. But just since 2007, we have paid $321.9 billion more into Confederation than we have taken out. And it's not a coincidence that during that time, Quebec has taken out over $400 billion. We are basically financing the federal government's equalization programs for Quebec. And, the federal government, especially under Trudeau, they used to say, oh, look at Quebec. They have low daycare prices. Oh, they have low tuition. Oh, they have such generous social. Yeah, they got it all because they're using our money to subsidize it all. So I understand the frustration that the separatists have with how Confederation is fiscally imbalanced. There is absolutely no question that it is. But I am not yet to the point where I think, well, Confederation is simply a crude balance sheet, so we're not getting any money out. Let's leave. But it is definitely a frustration. I've been frustrated with this since I was a teenager involved in youth politics back in the 1970s. And you don't have to be a separatist. In fact, most of the people I know who aren't separatists are equally frustrated by this. And every time we ask, hey, could you change the formula a bit because we're way overpaying? We're told, oh, I'm sorry. We can't do that. You're just bad Canadians for asking. It is so ungrateful for you and so miserly of you to ask. Like, we get dumped on from a great height by the Central Canadian Laurentian elite all the time. But do you ever hear anybody say from that same group of people in Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal, do you ever hear them say, well, Quebec is just ripping off Confederation? No, they never say that. So we do not get the kind of respect that we deserve, the contribution we make. And I think you could take a lot of steam out of the separatist cause by just showing up and saying, hey, Alberta, we couldn't get by without you. You're doing a great job. Thank you very much for your contributions. We'll see if we can't fix the equalization formula, because the equalization formula is rigged. It's got 33 factors in it. And whenever any of the have-not provinces look as though they're going to lose their have-not status, Ottawa goes in and jigs 3 or 4 or 5 of these factors so that they don't lose their money. That's Newfoundland, for instance, was going to lose its have-not status because of its oil wealth. Right. And it took Ottawa to court, since backed away from the court case, but it took Ottawa to court to say, you have to keep giving us equalization. No, we don't. The formula is quite clear. You don't earn it anymore, so therefore you shouldn't get it. But remember that when equalization started back in the 60s, back 58, I think it was, Quebecers were making about 65% of the average of the national income. They're now well over 90%. And Quebec is getting more equalization than it did in 58. So am I frustrated with that? Can I see a time in the future where that pushes me over the edge and I say, well, you're not paying any attention to us here. You still are disparaging everything Alberta does. Let's go. Like I really dislike the idea. And you get this, I'm sure you get this all the time from people who live in Toronto and Montreal and Ottawa. Oh, it's just such a backwoods out there. You people don't have culture. You don't know any of the sophisticated things that are going. Have you ever tried to figure out how the oil business works? It's one of the most sophisticated businesses in the entire world. I was being walked through it about 3 or 4 years ago by a senior oil executive. And I was gobsmacked, right? My eyes glazed over. It is so complicated. I had no idea that that's what effort they have to put in order to make money out of the oil sands and the oil patch. So we don't get respect for that. We don't get any acknowledgement for the fact that we contribute more than anyone else, more than everyone else who contributes. So we contribute about $322 billion. Ontario and BC are the only other two provinces that contribute at all, and they contribute about 42% of what we contribute.
Well, and I mean, you're going to have that with the richest jurisdictions, right? I mean, it exists to some extent in the U.S. So, I mean, look, Alberta's not looking for more transfers from Ottawa. And yeah, look, if Ottawa cut taxes, which they could or should, I mean, that would obviously affect all Canadians, not just Albertans. But I think, as you say, it's about that respect. It's about that acknowledgement, I think, to another level too. And hopefully we're seeing this now addressed. It's also kind of about not holding Alberta down, right? Getting out of Alberta's way.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, if the worst in the world had happened and somehow Justin Trudeau had stayed on as Liberal leader and the Liberals had won another majority, I think there would be a great push for us to get out of here because they were doing exactly what you said. They were holding us down. They were looking at our biggest industry and they were saying, no, we have to shut that down. Now, there are almost as many emissions out of the manufacturing and auto sectors in Ontario as there is out of the oil and gas sector in Alberta, but you don't ever hear them saying, well, we better shut down the auto sector. That's just, we have to save the planet. The most they would do is they'd say, look, we're going to pump, it's now close to $60 billion into electric vehicles. And so as we cut back on internal combustion vehicles, the workers will move over to these EV plants and they won't lose their high wages and their prime jobs. But in Alberta, I mean, there was even an internal memo from the Natural Resources Department about 2 years ago that said, well, an awful lot of people in Alberta are going to have to transition to delivery drivers and telephone clerks if they lose their oil. That's like a third of what they're making now in the patch. How is that respect? It's not.
So even if there's a point that separatists make about Alberta's outsized contribution, about the lack of respect, there's some onus on them too, I think. And you wrote a piece this week about some of their unrealistic claims about this utopia that this Alberta Republic would be. And look, obviously they had an angry reaction to Alberta's premier pointing out some obvious facts about going from being a subnational government to an independent state. Where do you think that they're drifting off a little too much into sort of fantasyland territory?
Well, they're just being driven by their anger. There isn't an awful lot of intellectualism in there. The one advantage, well, I guess there'd be two different things that are different about the Quebec separatist movement from the current Alberta separatist movement. One was in Quebec, they formed a political party, they recruited candidates, they ran in elections, they formed a government. And so had they won a referendum, they would have had a mandate to negotiate with Ottawa to leave the country. If these guys win their referendum, they're just going to leave it up to Smith, who doesn't want to go, to negotiate the separation. It's just crazy. But the other thing is they keep saying, and I moderated a debate with Keith Wilson, who's one of the principal separatist lawyers in the country back in early May. And I like Keith. He's a very, very good guy. Back in the 2000s, when the provincial government was trying to force through energy transmission lines over private property without any consultation with the owners, Keith went around the province and explained what was happening to people, and they pushed back. So I have a lot of respect for Keith. But the thing that came out of this debate over and over and over again was he thinks it's going to be easy. We have a person who's working on each of the issues. So getting out of CPP, getting getting the defense assets that Ottawa has in Alberta transferred over to Alberta, getting the national parks. There are just hundreds of issues that would come up. And take a look at Ottawa's fight with us over the CPP. So for 3 years now, they have been debating how much we would be owed if we left CPP to start an Alberta pension plan. That's 3 years. Now multiply that by 300 or 400 other issues. They're not going to just say, well, enjoy yourselves. It's been nice to be around you. And then Jeffrey Rath and Mitch Sylvester, who are the two leaders of the Alberta Prosperity Project, they say, oh, it's only going to cost about $6 billion to switch from federal government to Alberta government. How do you figure that? Like maybe Smith's estimation of 400 billion is too high. Might work out that it's about 230 or 300 billion. They've set up an independent third-party examination of what the costs are going to be, and I'm waiting to see what that's going to show. But it's not $6 billion. So I think the only people that the separatists are appealing to at the moment are people who are as angry as they are. And sure, lots of anger in the province, justifiably so. Ottawa, as I said, Ottawa dumps it on us from a great height whenever it gets a chance. But anger alone is not getting you out of the country.
What's the thing? I mean, even 20 or 25%, I mean, that's still close to 1 million Albertans. So it's real. There's anger there. What do you make of, we talked about polls suggesting that there's a bit of softening then or a drop in separatist support? I mean, October's a ways away. Things could go sideways on a lot of different fronts.
Oh, absolutely.
But is it kind of that sober realization of, it's one thing to be mad, but what is it we're actually talking about doing?
Well, and think of it this way. The Brexit referendum in England, when it was this far out, Brexit was down by about 10 points. And yet in the month and a half, what are we looking at? About 3.5 months before we have our referendum. In that 3.5 months, they caught up and passed the remain in the EU. So could things turn south for pro-Confederation types? Yes. And if a lot of the spokespeople for the pro-Confederation side are the same weak-lipped sentimentalists who are running the pro-Confederation movement at the moment, they just annoy people. But I think what will happen is separatists are too angry. The pro-Confederation types are too wishy-washy. And people just stay home. Well, then anger gets people out to the polls more than wishy-washy does. Yeah. So is it possible that the separatists could win? Of course it's possible. I don't think it's going to happen. But, I'm sure you've looked at those questions that the province is going to put on the referendum in October. Some of them are so complicated, I'm not sure that ordinary people are going to understand what they're all about. And if that happens, they'll just throw their hands up and they'll say, I'm not going to go bother with this. And if they don't go to vote, then the separatists will have an advantage because I guarantee you their people are angry enough to come out and vote.
Mm-hmm. You talked about this, I guess you call it a third option in between, the let's throw in the towel and separate versus everything is wonderful and the status quo is fine. And I think a lot of Albertans are kind of in that position where we
Mhm.
don't want to leave, but we don't think everything's wonderful either. Do you think the premier has embodied that in how she's approached this by, allowing this to happen, but also saying, hang on a second here, we can deal with Ottawa and other issues, but this just doesn't make sense.
She has recently kind of sort of started to say that. She needs to say it more directly. Look, I fully understand why you're upset about the way Ottawa treats us. We need to keep pushing ahead in order to get a fair deal for Alberta, but we're not going to get better by separating. It's just not going to happen. But there's other things that are happening on the pro-Confederation side, including from the premier. Like you hear warnings from the pro-Confederation side that, separation debate is tanking the economy. We're losing jobs. We're not. ATB came out this week with their quarterly projection for the next 2 years of Alberta's economy. We are going to lead the country. We've been leading the country for 2 years now in growth. We're going to lead for another 2 years. We have the fastest growing population, and people are coming to Alberta, not just for jobs. They're coming for quality of life as well. You can buy a house cheaper here. Now, if you're in Calgary right now and you're trying to buy a house, you're going to think I'm nuts, but it is way better than it is in Toronto or Vancouver. So, you can get a decent house. You can get a nice job. You can go to the mountains when you want to. It's a great place to live. And so these scare tactics that, the Edmonton Chamber of Commerce said, this is already dramatically affecting the economy. No, it's not. And there is no economic indicators that say it is. Our job creation rate is the highest in the country. And as I said, our growth rate's the highest in the country. And our job creation rate is interesting because it's now higher because of non-oil jobs than oil jobs. And that's the first time that's happened in a very long time. So, stop being a scaremonger. Just say, look, we're sick and tired of this. Let's come out and vote not to have a referendum in the future sometime about separation. But then let's just keep hammering it at Ottawa. I'm sick and tired. I really am doubtful that Mark Carney is going to get us a pipeline built because I don't really think he wants one. No. I think he's very good at stringing us along. If it happens, I don't think he would try and stop it if it happens. But he has put so many preconditions on it. And you have to find a private investor. You have to satisfy First Nations. You have to deal with all the regulatory stuff in BC. And when you get that done, come back to us. And we'll decide whether we're going to approve it or not. Well, none of their other major projects have those kind of preconditions on them. They're trying to help the other major projects get built, not so the pipeline. So do I have my doubts about Carney? Yeah, but oh my goodness, it's refreshing is not the right word, but it's a nice change of pace to see Carney talk about Alberta than to hear Trudeau or Guilbeault or anybody in that government talk about Alberta.
Well, I think Guilbeault has been thrown under the bus. I think Trudeau has been thrown under the bus. I mean, it was kind of funny to see at the G7 where these other countries all saying, we want Canadian energy. We've got now deals in place for Canadian LNG. We're building LNG after how many years of saying that nobody wanted this and that there was no case for it.
Yeah. But is Carney prepared to use his prime ministerial authority under the Constitution to push a pipeline out to the West Coast, and more importantly, to push one across Quebec out to the East Coast? And the second one I don't see happening at all. And the first one I am dubious about. So, the rest of the world wants our energy. We could easily become an energy superpower, but I don't see the political will in Ottawa to do that.
So I guess we'll get a decision on that before October, and I think that carries a lot of weight. We also made this weird scenario potentially where the Separatists lose on the ballot in October, but still manage to take out the premier as leader of the UCP, or push the UCP in another direction. And so I think what's happening on that side of things is really interesting. How much of a threat to Smith's leadership do you think is there?
I think there's a noticeable threat. I think enough of the members of her party are separatist inclined, and they could be angry with her for not pushing through on this. So could they create real trouble for her the way that the Take Back Alberta people created real trouble for Jason Kenney in 2022? Yes, I can see that. But I just have one phrase of caution for people who are prepared to do that. Can you say Premier in the head Nenshi?
Right. Because
that's what's going to happen. If you fragment the UCP, push another leader out for the second time in 4 years, and the only people who are going to benefit from that are the NDP. So if you think the province is better off with a fragmented UCP and an NDP government, okay, have at it.
We'll leave it there for now. Much more. EdmontonSun.com, EdmontonJournal.com. Interesting weeks ahead for sure. Lorne Gunter, always appreciate the conversation. Thank you so much for joining us here.
You bet, Rob.
All right. Once again, that was Lorne Gunter, veteran political columnist for Post Media, EdmontonSun.com, EdmontonJournal.com. Always appreciate conversation with Lorne. A lot going on in Alberta politics these days. One other point I wanted to mention, and it concerns the referendum itself and what it's going to cost to hold this referendum, to put all these questions on the ballot. How does that compare to holding a general election, which, by the way, we'll be doing in just over a year from now? One of the former chief electoral officers in Alberta came out recently and said this could cost about $130 million, several times the cost of the last provincial election. Now, maybe at the end of the day, you can make the case that it's all worth it. Look, direct democracy is not free. There's a cost in letting people have a say. But I think the Alberta government should be upfront about what it's going to cost to do this and why it's going to cost so much. But instead, when this question was put to Finance Minister Jason Nixon this week, he dismissed the idea that this would or should cost more than a general election.
I don't know what you're referring to as far as those estimates. I can tell you those seem extremely high to be able to run an election. It doesn't cost us this much to run a general election. So I'm not sure why Elections Alberta would need that level of money. Happy to look at that report. What I can tell you is that we'll make sure Elections Alberta has the resources to do the job that they need to do. But I can't see why a province-wide vote would cost any more than it would cost us to run a general election.
Okay, so look, I think there's some simple facts to point out here, and it's odd that the finance minister seems confused about any of this. It costs $37 million to administer the last provincial election in Alberta. We obviously don't know at this point what this referendum campaign is going to cost, but it's pretty easy to see why this would cost a lot more. Now, for one thing, the decision has been made that each of these questions in the referendum is going to be on a separate ballot. So Elections Alberta is printing 45 million ballots for this election. There were 1.8 million ballots cast in the last provincial election. So just there's more than 10 times as many ballots that are going to be necessary. There's a cost right there. But of course, there's also the staffing. And that's where so much of this cost comes in. There was just over 13,000 workers hired by Elections Alberta in the last provincial election. They're hiring 60,000 people for this referendum campaign because of how many ballots there are, because of the Alberta government's requirements regarding how those ballots be counted. Remember, we, for whatever reason, had to get rid of the electronic vote tabulators. So it all has to be counted by hand. So the number of people that are being hired is several times what it was in the last provincial election. So more than 10 times the number of ballots, more than 4 times the number of staff that are going to be required to administer this election. Why on earth would we expect that this is going to be anywhere near the cost of the last provincial election? again, I mean, make the case that it's all worth it then, if you believe that it is, but to try to gaslight Albertans and tell them it's not going to cost any more than the last provincial election is just absurd. So we'll see what the final price tag looks like, but obviously it's going to be well beyond what the last provincial election cost, and the Alberta government should just be upfront about that. Anyway, much more at our website, robbreakenridge.ca. I mentioned our conversation this week with the Premier about the upcoming referendum. You can check that out at nationalpost.com. You can find this podcast on our YouTube channel, Rob Breakenridge Show. You can also find it on all the audio platforms, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, and the rest. Again, thanks so much for joining us here this week. Have yourselves a fantastic weekend. We'll be back with you next week. Take care. Hey, folks, thanks for watching and listening. You can find us at robbreakenridge.ca. Also, make sure you hit that subscribe button below and stay connected with The Rob Breakenridge Show.